Okay, good. All right. So I am presenting a case study on type 2 diabetes. This study is going to be based on an individual who was part of a group project. And I do want to point out that this study is solely focused on type 2 diabetes. And my cat is meowing, so I apologize. There will be references to group activities that we did. As I said, it was part of a group, but the case study is solely focused on this one individual. At the end of my presentation, I will have some contact information if you want to contact me about anything. Obviously, in 20 minutes, we don't cover everything that we've done, but feel free to ask any questions. A quick background on our program. It was titled Building a Healthy Breckenridge. It was a collaboration between our local health department, my wellness studio, and our local fitness center. We asked interested community members to fill out an application, and as part of their entry to the program, they were given a membership to the fitness center, including access to classes as well as equipment. They would participate in group sessions regarding nutrition and healthy food choices. These would be led by our local extension office and the dietitian that serves our community. And members of the group would also receive individualized yoga therapy once per month with me. They were also able to get regular lab work done, including an A1C, and we will reference that later in the presentation. This was all funded by our local health department. We had 10 members in our first group, and I'm going to present the case study on one of the members who successfully completed the program and is actually enrolled in a second year and is playing a mentoring role for new members as well. So there's two studies I'd like to reference here in regards to why I chose type 2 diabetes. This map comes from a 2020 study, which reported that rural areas have a higher burden of type 2 diabetes compared to urban areas. The study states that there is an urgent need for interventions tailored to rural areas, given that rural Americans currently experience a disproportionate burden of type 2 diabetes and are encumbered by its associated morbidity, mortality, and loss in economic productivity. The first study finds evidence that diabetes mortality has declined in the United States over the past 2 decades, but that improvements in mortality vary considerably by place. Improvements are observed in urban America and in the Northeast and the Midwest, while diabetes mortality has remained largely unchanged in rural areas, particularly in the rural South. The second study combines data taken from 1999 to 2016 and analyzes changes in diabetes mortality in different regions of the US. It concluded that diabetes is one of the leading causes of death in the US, but important differences have emerged in the burden of the disease. Reductions in diabetes mortality are lagging in rural areas and the rural South in particular, relative to other areas of the country. Continued innovations in care and targeted interventions in rural areas are warranted. And these are significant to me because I do live in a rural area. I've pointed out my specific location with the red star on that map. So type 2 diabetes accounts for around 90% of all cases of diabetes. In type 2, the response to insulin is diminished, and this is defined as insulin resistance. During this state, insulin is ineffective and is initially countered by an increase in insulin production to maintain glucose homeostasis. But over time, insulin production decreases, resulting in type 2 diabetes. It is most commonly seen in persons older than 45. Still, it is increasingly seen in children, adolescents, and younger adults due to rising levels of obesity, physical inactivity, and poor diets. Type 2 diabetes can be managed with diet, exercise, and or medications, which may include pills, insulin, and other injectables. Some of the known risk factors include a family history, being overweight, being inactive, certain ethnic backgrounds, high blood pressure, and high cholesterol. Most type 2 diabetics will eventually require insulin, and diabetes over time can cause damage to eyes, kidneys, and nerves. If left untreated, it can cause damage to the heart and the carotid artery, and most diabetic deaths are a result of heart disease or stroke. Type 2 diabetes is often considered to be part of metabolic syndrome, which is several health conditions in the same individual, such as obesity, high blood pressure, high blood fat levels, and insulin resistance. As the body resists insulin over time due to metabolic syndrome, the pancreas becomes overworked and loses function over time, and it often becomes more difficult to control diabetes over a time period. And an A1C of 6.5% is part of that diagnosis, which we'll cover again in a moment. In Ayurveda, diabetes is called prameha and is divided into 20 categories. These are then divided based on dosha. Vata has 4 divisions, Pitta has 6, and Kapha has 10. Ayurveda claims the primary cause stems from lack of exercise, excessive sleep, unhealthy diet, and stress, all of which are imbalances in the Kapha dosha. Similar to Western medicine, Ayurveda attributes type 2 diabetes to poor nutrition, poor digestion, an imbalance in the nervous system, and stress, both physical and mental. So how type 2 diabetes shows up in the koshas and assessments and some tools which will be used, where I'm going to go next. I'll discuss the use of yoga therapy to balance the koshas from a broad perspective, as well as how it was presented during this particular case study with this specific client. So in the physical body, a few assessments that we might cover would include weight and measurements such as waist and hips, as well as labs. One of those labs would be an A1C, which is called the glycated hemoglobin A1C. This test gives an average of blood glucose over the last 2 to 3 months. Patients with an A1C greater than 6.5% are diagnosed as having diabetes according to the DSM-5. A1C is a convenient, rapid, standardized test and is not much affected by acute illness or stress. Type 2 diabetes can also cause damage to the joints and tissues, damage to the pancreas and other organs. And specifically for this client, our initial assessment included a brief postural assessment. We reviewed the noted areas during the year and we repeated that physical assessment as needed. We targeted balance and feet after our first session. Body weight comes into play during this case study, and adding physical movement to the client's daily life. In regards to setting specific physical goals at the onset of the program, I also want to note that the client began working to be a volunteer firefighter later in the year. She told me she never would have dreamed this would happen, but our goals shifted for this new project as well. And some of those included things such as planks, carrying a fire hose while she walked half a mile, climbing up a 3-story ladder, and carrying a chainsaw up 3 flights of stairs. As we move into the energy body, excess weight can cause restricted breathing, a lack of prana, and restriction in the vayus. Any type of breath assessment could be beneficial, such as breaths per minute. For this particular client, breath work and breath awareness were completely new. We also practiced a guided yoga nidra, which was a kosha balancing nidra, so it targeted all 5 koshas. And we did a 3-part breath with the hands to fill space, moving into the belly, the ribs, and the chest. We also did some movement throughout our sessions to encourage balancing the 7 chakras. As we move into the mind body, chronic disease, such as type 2 diabetes, can lead to stress on the nervous system, as well as a loss of sense of self. The management of type 2 diabetes can feel tedious and lead to stress. A few assessments that are appropriate for this kosha include the Maya and the DDS-17, which we'll refer to later. A few practices I did with this particular client were the kosha balancing nidra and several mindful eating practices. We also explored movement patterns and discussed how our movement and energy can be related to mood as well as depression and or anxiety. And thinking about how diabetes might interact with the intuitive body, the inability to listen to the body's signals for help can lead to a worsening of symptoms. The client may feel as though his or her body has let him or her down. Some good assessments here would be the Maya and also the DDS-17. With this client, we started to find quiet and stillness in the body to learn to listen for signals and messages the body might be sending. We focused on listening to diagnoses and reflecting on what can be improved with specific wellness practices such as movement, mindfulness, and meditation. We began to listen to the body in regards to resting as needed, especially when the client had some unexpected procedures during the year. And the client also began a regular journaling practice. Type 2 diabetes can affect the bliss body as well. Chronic diseases and lifestyle changes can affect one's ability to feel connected to the divine and to find true self and bliss. And some sample assessments here would be the DDS-17 or the bliss scale. And some practices to focus on the bliss body include looking for glimmers, developing tools to seek out moments of gratitude, and learning to practice self-love and self-compassion. We also worked on some somatosensory and trauma tools specifically for first responder situations as the client moved into her work to become the volunteer firefighter. I used several assessments throughout the year. The entire program as a group used A1C, weight, and measurements. I do want to mention two specific assessments I used that I felt were very beneficial for this program from a yoga therapy perspective. The first one is a scale I created to use with each client every month, and I specified it for this program. I would fill this out with clients at the beginning of every session. It had some questions specific to the program, but also included questions which were kosha specific. So we continue to make ongoing assessments throughout our practice. And the second assessment is the DDS-17, short for Diabetes Distress Scale. I have a few sample questions on this slide. There's actually 17 questions total, and there is scoring for the entire questionnaire, but it's also broken down into scoring categories such as emotional burden, physician-related distress, regimen-related distress, and interpersonal distress that can be part of living with type 2 diabetes and can help narrow the focus for offering client support. During our fourth session, the client and I completed a DDS-17 together. Unfortunately, I was not aware of the survey prior to beginning this group. The client scored well, and I think improvement would have been seen from the first session if I had given her the DDS-17 when we started. As I'm in my practicum year, I chalked this up to a learning experience. When we sat down to fill it out, the client and I had an open discussion of how her answers would have changed if we'd filled it out originally versus filling it out 4 months into the program. I will definitely implement it with other clients in the future. And I completed it with several clients and could tell the ones who were struggling with the program scored in a way that showed they were struggling with the management of their type 2 diabetes. So moving on to my work with a specific client, when we had our first session, she shared that she was on medication for elevated blood pressure, high cholesterol, anxiety, 2 anti-diabetic medications, and was also on a mood stabilizer. Her personal goals were to play with her grandchildren and to be healthier overall. 9 years prior to starting the program, the client was initially diagnosed with type 2 diabetes and had an A1C of 13.9. Through diet and exercise, she lost a significant amount of weight and reduced her A1C, but since that time had returned to her old habits and was deciding she wanted a fresh start. She wanted her work in the Build a Healthy Breath program to be lifelong, and she told me she knew it would be hard work, but would be worth it to develop habits which she could sustain. The client had never practiced yoga, told me that she was intimidated by this portion of the program, but was willing to do whatever it takes to be successful on this journey. The client and I met monthly, one-on-one, over a 1-year period. The entire group had activities and assignments for each month, but my work with her was set up to meet her individual needs. Our initial session was for me to explain yoga therapy and my portion of the program to her. We also used this as a time to go over her health inventory and do a brief postural assessment. I used this information to develop a personalized plan for her, but I knew that plan would most likely be adapted throughout the year as we met. After that, we met on a monthly basis to add new tools as needed and discuss the client's improvements and/or concerns from the prior month. Usually after I meet with clients, I give them 3 small homework assignments to do to target the goals and areas where I think we need to focus our time and energy over the next month. So a few highlights from our time together. Some of the tools that we used for pranayama include, most of the group did not have a regular breath practice, so we had some short videos throughout the year to lead them through some basic breathing techniques. This individual client, as stated earlier, was completely new to the practice of yoga. After our initial assessment, I decided to begin with some breath awareness, and we continued to implement new pranayama tools throughout our time together. Simply noticing the breath moving in and out of the body was a great start for this client. Body awareness was one of our big goals, and while breath work was the first step in the process, we continued to build on it throughout our sessions. We practiced a 3-part breath, and we also moved that to the mirror to watch the body move with the breath. We practiced square breathing when it was appropriate for the client, and we practiced some 4-7-8 breathing when the client needed some tools for sleep and relaxation. Guided meditation was also a new concept for the entire group. I introduced a few meditation practices in the group setting. I instructed them in how to use the Insight Timer app early on. We also did a group mindful eating practice where everyone chose a treat from a variety of snacks that I bring. And before enjoying it, they write down 5 descriptive words regarding taste, texture, smell, or what they're expecting to experience. And they place it in their mouth, close the eyes, and hold it for 5 seconds. After this, they can consume the treat, and then they discuss with a partner how the actual taste or experience compared to their expectation. This particular client also looked up guided meditations on YouTube to implement in her practice. We did several mindful practices together regarding food and emotional eating decisions. The client and I practiced a sensory awareness meditation. We also practiced some tapping. After we practiced the tapping together, I sent her a video to do at home, and she told me she began to create her own version and set it to the sound of a metronome. She said her young grandchildren struggle with anxiety, and she has begun practicing that with them as well. We did the Kirtan Kriya, and I helped her to create a personalized version for herself when she was suffering with memory issues and what she termed brain fog after a surgical procedure. We also did a kosha balancing yoga nidra, and the client has now developed her own Sunday evening meditation practice, which she does weekly. In a group setting for this population, it is appropriate to find a practice that is gentle for beginners and to bring in movement that helps to balance excess kapha. With the group, I offered basic movements to begin to practice daily. This included moving the spine in all directions and offered modifications for seated or standing. From an individual perspective, I found in our first session that the client had some variations in posture regarding the neck and shoulders. She was a receptionist and was able to tell me right away that she always sits with the phone resting between the same shoulder and ear. We worked on doing some myofascial release and also body awareness in regards to how she spends her days. She has since rearranged her office space and has become a referral point for others who have struggled with the same issues. The client also made notable improvement in her balance, which we began measuring at our first session and continue throughout the year. I also feel like her yoga practice was very beneficial when she had limited physical movement after a surgical procedure and allowed her some freedom to continue to move her body in a safe way. One of the requirements for the program was to begin to journal exercise, nutrition, and lifestyle habits. The entire group was given exercise and food journals to keep throughout the year, and I also offered regular journaling prompts for them as well. The client and I talked a lot about journaling prompts, and she has begun a regular journaling practice, which goes beyond the group assignments. When our year was almost completed, the owner of the fitness center asked this client to write her story so it could be shared on social media. She told me it was very hard, and she broke down in tears several times because she realized how hard she had been on herself and how very far she has come in this program as she read through her entries. She also told me she's working to leave a legacy for her grandchildren and is setting aside journaling time for that specifically. Because I worked with this client for a year, our plan did change and adapt during our sessions. I knew this would happen. I knew that my plan would have to vary some. The client set goals throughout the year and near the end decided to become a volunteer firefighter for her community. This is actually a picture of her here in her uniform. We were able to practice some somatosensory and trauma releasing practices. We talked about trauma in regard to first responders as well as their interaction with victims. We revisited the pranayama practices as tools for this new toolbox. And she also borrowed a book from me titled Relentless Courage, which was recommended to me by a police officer and is a great tool to have. She wanted to use this to help become more mindful of how she might respond in a traumatic situation. And this slide shows some of the measurable outcomes that the client achieved during our year-long session. I would also like to point out she had a significant decrease in the number of medications she is now taking, which was one of her goals. She and I have had many conversations about the importance of mindfulness and meditation on her wellness journey. There's a little variation on this slide. I have a quote from the client that I placed in the top right, and that quote was actually in July of 2023. So it was 1 year from the start of the program. And then the numbers in the middle on the right-hand side are from October because that's when I actually wrote my case study, but just a subtle variation. So some of the most notable things, she lost 10 inches in her waist, nearly 75 pounds in weight, and her A1C is well below 6.5. And the client was willing to share that photo. While physical results were amazing, she stated how empowering it felt to be able to take a selfie. From the time I start working with each client, I have the goal of bringing union to the koshas. I felt like we were successful in this endeavor. I felt like our successes ranged from the positive outcomes listed in the previous slide regarding the Annamaya kosha to the client's new awareness of breath work. I felt we found balance in the chakras, and the client feels she can successfully navigate through the challenges of type 2 diabetes through listening to her body and continuing to seek out her true self. I also feel she has developed new tools and skills to navigate this journey. So I do want to say a big thanks to my mentor, Mary, for her assistance with this case study, all my work over the last few years. Thank you to my family, my friends, the community for their love, support, and encouragement. Big thanks to Christy and Felicia for all they do for all of us in the program. And thank you to Cohort 4 for their encouragement and modeling of amazing therapy practice. And I also want to offer a thanks to Shauna Amstutz, Jennifer Pyle, Tasha Tucker, and Lynette Ellen. They helped to lead that program. And a big thanks to my client for allowing me to share her story. And if you have any questions, there's my contact info. Feel free to reach out.